You've probably heard it as the ultimate Cold War story. Two superpowers split Korea in half because they represented two opposing ideologies, and neither side would budge. Communism versus capitalism, drawn as a line straight down the middle of a nation that had no say in the matter. But here's the problem with that version. The line wasn't drawn by ideology at all. It was drawn in about 30 minutes, late at night, by two American colonels using a wall map torn out of a magazine. The real origin of Korea's division isn't a story about deliberate Cold War planning. It's a story about how a temporary military convenience, made in a rush to beat a deadline, hardened into one of the most permanent borders on Earth. Understand that, and you understand how so many of today's most stubborn political borders started as decisions nobody actually meant to make permanent. Here's the version most people carry around. World War II ends. Japan surrenders. Two victorious powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, move into the vacuum left behind in Korea. A peninsula Japan had colonized for 35 years. Because Washington and Moscow represent opposing systems, each side props up a government that mirrors its own ideology in its half of the country. The line becomes the Cold War's front line. 5 years later, that ideological standoff explodes into the Korean War. The Armistice Line, drawn in 1953, still splits the peninsula today, and the demilitarized zone remains the most heavily fortified border on the planet. A permanent monument to a deliberate ideological split, every fact in that version is true. What's missing is the sequence of events that actually produced the line in the first place. And once you see that sequence, ideological partition stops being an adequate explanation for how any of this started. Start with the pace of Japan's collapse in August 1945, because it moved faster than anyone in Washington had planned for. The atomic bombs fell on the 6th and 9th of that month. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the 8th, and Soviet forces began pouring into Manchuria and northern Korea almost immediately. Fast, organized, and already close. American forces, by contrast, were still sitting on Okinawa, weeks away by sea. Japan's surrender came within days, catching American planners with no finished blueprint for who would occupy which part of the Korean peninsula. What no one in the popular version tells you is what happened next, inside the War Department, on the night of August 10th into the 11th. Two young Army officers, Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, neither of them senior policymakers, both of them junior staff officers doing what they were told, were given roughly 30 minutes to propose a military demarcation line, splitting Korea for the purpose of accepting the Japanese surrender. Nothing more grand than that. They weren't drafting a permanent political border. They were solving a logistics problem. With a clock running out and Soviet troops already advancing, they didn't have a proper military map of Korea on hand. Rusk himself later admitted, in his own memoir, that they worked from a small-scale National Geographic map pinned to the wall, looking for a line that would divide the peninsula in a way that was administratively workable and, critically, would still place the capital, Seoul, inside the American zone. They landed on the 38th parallel. It cut cleanly across the map. It had no relationship to Korea's existing provincial boundaries, no ethnic or linguistic logic, no basis in how Koreans themselves organized their own country. It was chosen because it looked reasonable on a magazine map, at night, under a deadline. That proposal went to Moscow the same night. And here's the detail that should stop the ideological partition story cold. The Soviets accepted it almost immediately, without pushback, without negotiation, despite the fact that their forces were already positioned to take far more of the peninsula than the line gave them. Historians still point to that quick, low-friction acceptance as proof that this wasn't a carefully contested ideological carve-up. It was two exhausted wartime allies settling a logistics question fast, before the practical situation on the ground got more complicated than either side wanted to manage. The line's original job was purely administrative. American forces would accept the Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. Soviet forces would accept it north of the line. That's all it was designed to do. The actual long-term plan for Korea's political future had already been sketched out separately, going back to the 1943 Cairo Declaration and formalized at the Moscow Conference in December of 1945, a joint trusteeship involving the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China meant to guide a unified, independent Korea to self-government within roughly 5 years. The 38th parallel was never supposed to be a border between two nations. It was a temporary seam meant to be stitched back together. What actually tore that seam open wasn't ideology descending from Washington and Moscow. It was what happened on the ground in Korea itself over the following 2 years. Korean political groups, across the political spectrum, left and right alike, reacted to the trusteeship plan with fury. To a population that had just spent 35 years under Japanese colonial rule, the idea of yet another period of foreign supervised government, however well-intentioned, read as an insult to a sovereignty they'd only just reclaimed. Mass protests broke out. The plan meant to unify Korea became almost immediately one of the most divisive issues inside Korea itself. Laid on top of that came the U.S. Soviet Joint Commission, meeting through 1946 and into 1947, tasked with actually implementing the trusteeship, deciding which Korean political groups would be consulted, which would form the basis of a future unified government. The talks collapsed repeatedly over exactly that question, each side accusing the other of trying to stack the process in favor of allies who matched its own political leanings. And behind those failed negotiations sat a broader, fast-hardening global reality. The wartime alliance between Washington and Moscow was curdling into the Cold War in real time, and neither side, by 1947, trusted the other enough to hand over meaningful influence in a country sitting at the edge of both their spheres. With the Joint Commission dead, the matter went to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. The Soviet-controlled North refused to allow UN-supervised elections on its side of the line. The South went ahead alone, holding elections in May 1948 that produced Syngman Rhee's Republic of Korea. Weeks later, the North formalized its own government under Kim Il-sung, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Two governments, each claiming legitimate authority over the entire peninsula, now stood on either side of a line two colonels had drawn from a magazine map 3 years earlier, a line that had never been intended to separate a nation at all. This is the through line the popular story skips entirely. The Korean War that erupted in 1950 wasn't simply two ideologies invading each other across an agreed frontier. It was, in real part, two rival Korean governments, Kim Il-sung's North and Syngman Rhee's South, each trying to erase an artificial line neither of them had chosen, each convinced that unifying the peninsula under its own system was the natural, rightful outcome. The war didn't create the division. The division, born out of a rushed logistics decision and a collapsed trusteeship, helped create the conditions for the war. And this pattern isn't unique to Korea. Plenty of the world's most seemingly permanent borders, hastily drawn colonial lines across Africa, the Radcliffe Line that split India and Pakistan in a matter of weeks in 1947, trace back to the same basic mechanism. A line meant as a temporary administrative fix, drawn under time pressure by officials without the authority or the intention to make it permanent, outlives the emergency that produced it because the political process meant to undo it collapses before it can act. The reckoning for Korea has now stretched past 75 years. Millions of families were separated by a boundary none of them voted for and few of them understood the origin of. Two societies grew up on opposite sides of a line that was never meant to define a nation, developing along radically different economic and political paths until the temporary military convenience of 1945 became, in practice, one of the most rigid and heavily fortified borders that has ever existed. Here's what's easy to conflate and worth separating clearly. Why the line was drawn and why it lasted are two different questions with two different answers. The origin was administrative, a rushed, arbitrary fix under wartime pressure. The permanence was political, the product of collapsed diplomacy and hardening Cold War distrust. Historians who reduce it to ideological partition are really only answering the second question, and calling it the first. You've probably assumed at least one other border in the world today was the product of careful, deliberate design. Most borders you could name were not. Now that you know two colonels and a magazine map started this one, does Cold War division still feel like the real explanation for how Korea got split, or does it look like the story of what happened after the real decision had already been made?